back to this week's episode of Seeking Proof, Finding Grace. I'm your host, Ron Campbell, and this week, as with every week, I want to start off by reminding you of the most important truth in the entire universe. God loves you. Welcome to 2025. And as we're getting started in 2025, we're about to start on a new portion of our journey. We've worked our way up to our little blue planet floating out here in space, but we're about to go from lifelessness to life. And we're about to conclude this portion of our journey to determine, were we created, or are we just the product of random chance? Are we the product of an intelligent third party, or do we just happen to find ourselves here and this is just the universe that happened to evolve on its own? And as we get ready to start this journey, I thought this might be a good time to maybe take a step back and talk a little bit about our worldview. You know, as we've taken this journey, we've run into, and I think we find three primary things at each step along the way. And we're going to see the same things largely as we go forward in the next step of this. As we reach each one of these decision points, where we take a step back and we look at what's in front of us and we say, okay, what is the driving factor behind this set of circumstances? You know, we've seen multiple steps along the way. The appearance of the universe from nothing. So the universe either created itself out of nothing, is the byproduct of the work of an intelligent outside third party, or somehow was a necessary agent and came into being because it had to come into being. But those three things, the product of random chance, the product of absolute necessity bringing things together, some unguided force, you might say, maybe guided more than unguided, or the handiwork of an intelligent outside third party. Those three possibilities, when we look at everything from about the 30,000 foot view, that's oftentimes what we find. And we can come up with what the scientific theories may be called, or what the various ideas may be called, or things like that. But each one of them tends to fall into one of those three categories. And what we've seen along the way is that naturalism, agnosticism, atheism, whatever you want to call it, relies heavily on option number one, that we are the byproduct of chance. Call it chance, you can call it luck, you can call it whatever you want to call it, but that we simply are the recipient of the most remarkable stretch of universal luck ever possibly conceived of. And there is so much luck, and if you go back and look at previous episodes, I would argue there's not enough luck in an infinite number of universes and an infinite number of chances to possibly get us to where we are today before we even begin this journey from lifelessness to life. But option number one tends to be the option that naturalism, agnosticism, and atheism has to build itself around, because it comes from an unguided, random process. And when you break it down in the end, it comes down to luck. Time and luck, and that's about it. The second option of, well, it's by necessity, these things had to come together the way they did, really, that pretty much dies out in each one of these. Because it's either the result of luck or it's the result of random chance. And an outside guiding force tends to start sneaking in the possibility of an outside third party at some point. And so that option doesn't seem to be terribly useful in most cases. And then finally, the third option, well, the third option is that of an intelligent outside third party. Right now, we're not saying who that is. Eventually down the road later this year, we're going to talk about who I believe that is and what the evidence is supporting that. But when you look at those three options, as we do, a lot of times we find ourselves in the same place at each one of these steps. And I think what the evidence has shown as we've worked along the way is that at every single time, at every single moment where we've taken a step back and we've looked at what exactly happened here. Did the universe come from nothing on its own, or was it likely created by an outside third party? Do we see the fine-tuning of the universe as a result of random chance for a life-permitting universe? Or is it more likely the handiwork of an intelligent outside third party? Do we, when we look at the journey from nothingness to the planet that we have today, the steps along the way to get us to this little blue planet that we're sitting on floating out here in space, again, do we see that as the handiwork of an intelligent third party, or do we see that as the result of luck and chance? At each step along the way, what we've seen, the evidence points to the most likely answer being an intelligent outside third party. I know you can debate that, and I know that there will be people who look at that and say that is absolutely untrue. But as we look at this evidence, and as we consider this going forward, what we've been trying to do is to build a worldview around this. We're trying to look at our worldview and say, does our worldview work in the real world? As I looked at this idea of worldview, I looked at some of my past readings and some stuff online, and I think one of my favorite definitions of worldview, there's a lot of them out there, tends to be definitions that incorporate four things: origin, meaning, morality, and destiny. And when you look at them, it makes sense why. We need to know where we came from. And that's what we've been talking about this whole time. And if we know where we're going, and there's a clear evidence of that we're heading in a specific direction, those two kind of bookend everything else and add an enormous amount of context to everything in the middle. Beyond that, when you get into the middle of that, meaning as it's derived has a tremendous difference. If you believe that, well, we're the result of random chance and we're going nowhere, the universe will eventually grow cold and die. Okay, that dramatically impacts the idea of meaning in your life, and certainly the idea of morality, because, and we'll talk about this later, but without a creator, without an objective lawgiver, there cannot be objective moral laws. And we'll talk about that later. It doesn't mean that people can't be moral who are atheists. That's not what I'm saying at all. We'll talk about that more down the road. Put a pin in that one and we'll approach that one later. But when you look at all four of them and you bring them together into a cohesive worldview, something that you can build your life around that has a good foundation, if you have to keep coming back to the idea of luck, this is what I want to caution everybody on. As we take this next step forward, this is where the rubber meets the road for a lot of us, is the idea of evolution. This is what we've been taught in school. It's a little bit easier to grasp and understand, maybe to wrap our arms around and understand than some of the physics and some of the things we've been talking about of getting from nothing to where we are today. It's a little less philosophical in some ways and a little bit more concrete that you can reach out and touch. But at every step along the way, what I think you're going to find is we're going to find these three same options. Is it the result of random chance? Is it the result of intelligent design by an independent third party? Or is it the result of unknown guiding forces and things just had to be this way? And we're going to find ourselves again looking at the idea of, could we be the result of random chance? Or do we see the fingerprint of a creator? And as we come to this point, I hope everybody will take a step back and maybe consider your worldview as you've looked at this. Does the worldview that you've based your life around work with everything that we've seen so far, with the idea of a universe coming from nothing, with the idea of a universe so finely tuned for it to be life permitting that it defies the mathematical possibility of luck being an option? The idea of a galaxy and a solar system and a planet created that's just so perfectly suited to everything, and all of the things that went into that, our moon and just every aspect of the way this planet's put together being so perfectly supportive of life. At some point, does the luck run out? And I think it's important to step back and answer that question as we go along the way. We're going to go through multiple weeks looking at this. Will probably be this summer before we move on to the next phase, because as you look at this and we break this journey down, there are so many things that I was taught when I was in high school back in the 80s, a million years ago, that were known to be wrong in the 80s. They were scientifically disproven, in some cases 100 years before I was in school, and yet I was taught them as scientific fact. And when I look at some of these things and I look back, it's amazing the assumptions that we make and the credit that we're willing to give the theory of evolution, as it looks like, or neo-Darwinian theory, whatever we want to call it as we go forward. And I want to encourage everybody to be careful and to just watch as we go forward as the evidence begins to pile up. And as we begin to see, again, very clearly the fingerprint of a creator as we go forward. We talked about on the last show, the show for Christmas morning, this idea of the Christmas story and what it meant. But I think before you reject out of hand a creator, this is where I am going to shift gears to Christianity. At some point down the road, I am going to make the argument that the independent third party that we see is actually the God of the Bible. My cards have obviously always been on the table, but there's the admission. At some point, I am going to make that argument. I'm not there yet. But assuming that is the case, I want you just for a moment to consider that The God of the Bible is a God who loved you so much he gave everything for you. He laid down eternity. He lived a perfect, sinless life. He died on a cross, the most horrible, awful, painful death, to redeem not just all of mankind, yes, all of mankind, but you individually, me individually. And he is waiting to reconcile us to himself, to bring us into an eternal relationship with him. Now, the choice is ours. Whether we accept the offer or reject the offer, whether we're willing to move forward or whether we say, no, I'm going to do it on my own. And I'm going to live my life on my own. But when we look at this idea of our origin and we recognize the idea of our destiny, there's something built into each one of us that tells us that we're more important than just a couple of random molecules that happen to bump into each other and evolve into us. There's something inside of us that tells us that we're way more important than that. And that something is your Creator calling you back. So, like I said, before we started, I wanted to call everybody's attention to this idea of worldview. When we talk about worldview and we think about that, does your worldview, when you look at the idea of origin, actually work with the scientific evidence that we've talked about and that we've looked at? Or is it over and over again reliant on luck and ridiculous amounts of luck that you would never live your life by, but that somehow you based your eternity on, your destiny? And if the answer is no, then just all I'm asking for is keep an open mind as we go forward through all of this. In the weeks to come, we're going to look at this journey from lifelessness to life, and we're going to talk about a lot of the things that we get wrong along the way. And as we do, I think you're going to find that there's a lot more to you than maybe we sometimes realize, and that you are the most special thing in all of creation put together for a very specific purpose. Sometimes we look in the mirror and we're not impressed enough. And hopefully we're going to change that over the next weeks and months to come. Thank you so much for joining me this week. I hope you'll be back next week. If you like this week's episode, I hope you'll consider hitting the like button for this episode and subscribing to the podcast. You can find us on our website at prooftograce.com. You can reach out to us at prooftogраce@yahoo.com if you've got any questions via email. And you can always find our podcasts on YouTube, on iTunes, and on Spotify. Thank you so much for joining us, and I hope to see you next week. Bye-bye.